Scent of Apples by Bienvenido Santos. In October, I arrived in Kalamazoo while the war was still raging, and I noticed gold and silver stars hanging in windows of quiet cottages, marking homes of soldiers away at war. An old man was burning leaves in the yard while a gray-haired woman sat on the porch, both seemingly lost in thought about a boy with blue eyes who had gone off to fight, wondering where he might be now as the autumn leaves turned gold. Later that evening, I left my hotel for a speaking engagement, feeling the icy wind from Lake Michigan, which seemed to bring winter early. The leaves on the pavement shone like bronze under the lampposts, rolling like the ghostly footsteps of past autumns, long before the boys left for faraway lands without cold winds, apple trees, or the golden beauty of fall. It was the same night I met Celestino Fabia, just a Filipino farmer as he called himself, who had a farm about 30 miles east of Kalamazoo. "You came all that way on a night like this just to hear me talk?"
"I've seen no Filipino for so many years now,"
he answered quickly.
"So when I saw your name in the papers, where it says, you come from the islands, and that you're going to talk, I come right away."
Earlier that evening, I spoke to a college crowd, mostly women, who seemed eager to hear about my country, which had become a lost nation, overrun by the enemy and shrouded in silence. Many of their boys were stationed there or heading to remote islands in the Pacific, still young and thinking of home. Speaking about my people, whom I loved and knew well, was not difficult, though I must have spoken with some fervor and nostalgia. During the open forum, the audience asked if there were differences between our women and American women. I answered as best I could, admitting I knew little about American women beyond their friendliness, and that comparing inner qualities was difficult. While I was explaining this, a man stood up at the back of the hall. Though he seemed slight, old, and brown, I knew immediately that he was a fellow Filipino.
"I'm a Filipino,"
he began, loud and clear, in a voice that seemed used to wide-open spaces.
"I'm just a Filipino farmer out in the country."
He waved his hand toward the door.
"I left the Philippines more than 20 years ago and have never been back. Never will, perhaps. I want to find out, sir, are our Filipino women the same, like they were 20 years ago?"
As the man sat down, the hall grew quiet, and I carefully considered my response. I didn't want to lie or be insincere, but I also didn't want to dishearten my fellow countrymen, who likely held on to certain ideals or illusions as an exile. "First," I said as the voices gradually died down and every eye seemed upon me, "first, tell me what our women were like 20 years ago." The man stood to answer.
"Yes,"
he said.
"You're too young. 20 years ago our women were nice. They were modest. They wore their hair long. They dressed proper and went for no monkey business. They were natural. They went to church regular, and they were faithful."
He had spoken slowly, and now in what seemed like an afterthought, added,
"It's the men who ain't."
Now I knew what I was going to say. "Well," I began, "it will interest you to know that our women have changed, but definitely. The change, however, has been on the outside only. Inside, here, pointing to the heart, they are the same as they were 20 years ago. God-fearing, faithful, modest, and nice." The man was visibly moved.
"I'm very happy, sir,"
he said, in the manner of one who, having stakes on the land, had found no cause to regret one's sentimental investment. After this, everything that was said and done in that hall that night seemed like an anticlimax, and later, as we walked outside, he gave me his name and told me of his farm 30 miles east of the city. We had stopped at the main entrance to the hotel lobby. We had not talked very much on the way. As a matter of fact, we were never alone. Kindly American friends talked to us, asked us questions, said goodnight. So now I asked him whether he cared to step into the lobby with me and talk.
"No, thank you,"
he said.
"You are tired, and I don't want to stay out too late."
"Yes, you live very far."
"I got a car,"
he said.
"Besides—"
Now he smiled. He truly smiled. All night I had been watching his face and I wondered when he was going to smile.
"Will you do me a favor, please?"
He continued smiling almost sweetly.
I want you to have dinner with my family out in the country. I'd call for you tomorrow afternoon, then drive you back. Will that be all right?
Of course, I said. I'd love to meet your family. I was leaving Kalamazoo for Muncie, Indiana, in 2 days. There was plenty of time.
You will make my wife very happy,
he said. You flatter me.
Honest, she'll be very happy. Ruth is a country girl and hasn't met many Filipinos. I mean Filipinos younger than I, cleaner looking. We're just poor farmer folk, you know, and we don't get to town very often. Roger, that's my boy. He goes to school in town. A bus takes him early in the morning, and he's back in the afternoon. He's a nice boy.
I bet he is, I agreed. I've seen the children of some of the boys by their American wives, and the boys are tall, taller than their father, and very good looking.
Roger, he'd be tall. You'll like him.
Then he said goodbye, and I waved to him as he disappeared in the darkness. The next day he came, at about 3 in the afternoon. There was a mild, ineffectual sun shining, and it was not too cold. He was wearing an old brown tweed jacket and worsted trousers to match. His shoes were polished, and although the green of his tie seemed faded, a colored shirt hardly accentuated it. He looked younger than he appeared the night before now that he was clean-shaven and seemed ready to go to a party. He was grinning as we met.
Oh, Ruth can't believe it.
He kept repeating as he led me to his car, a nondescript thing in faded black that had known better days and many hands.
I says to her, I'm bringing you a first-class Filipino. And she says, I'll go away. Quit kidding. There's no such thing as first-class Filipino. But Roger, that's my boy. He believed me immediately. What's he like, Daddy? He asks. Oh, you will see, I says. He's first class, like you, Daddy. No, I laugh at him. Your daddy ain't first class. Oh, but you are, Daddy, he says. So you can see what a nice boy he is, so innocent. Then Ruth starts griping about the house. But the house is a mess, she says. True, it's a mess. It's always a mess. But you don't mind, do you? We're poor folks, you know.
The trip seemed interminable. We passed through narrow lanes and disappeared into thickets, and came out on barren land overgrown with weeds in places. All around were dead leaves and dry earth. In the distance were apple trees. Aren't those apple trees? I asked, wanting to be sure.
Yes, those are apple trees,
he replied.
Do you like apples? I got lots of them. I got an apple orchard. I'll show you.
All the beauty of the afternoon seemed in the distance, on the hills, in the dull soft sky. Those trees are beautiful on the hills, I said.
Autumn's a lovely season. The trees are getting ready to die, and they show their colors, proud-like.
No such thing in our own country, I said. The remark, which I later realized was unkind, led him down a long-forgotten path of memories. Exiles often take painful detours in their minds, revisiting lost youth and old hurts. As we traveled along the noisy road, I couldn't hear everything he said, but I understood. He was telling his story for the first time in years, reflecting on his youth and home. In those moments, there was no fear or pain. Those would come later, perhaps in the stillness of the night or under the apple trees on the farm. In an old Visayan town with narrow, dirty streets scattered with coral shells, our house was the largest and one of the oldest, easily recognizable. Entering through a heavy door, you'd find a dark hall leading to a staircase with the smell of roosting chickens in the air. The house was always dim, with closed windows blocking out the sun. Mother, pale and sickly, sat quietly in her corner, never speaking. Father was the opposite, loud, constantly moving, and always talking about honor as if it were the only thing that mattered. I was born and raised in that house, growing into a spoiled and mean child. One day, I broke my parents' hearts. I saw my mother cry silently as my father cursed me and drove me out, the gate closing heavily behind me. My siblings shared my father's hatred for me, multiplying it with their own pain. Yet, despite everything, I sometimes missed that house, the roosting chickens, my pale mother sitting in her corner, and the massive tree trunks that supported the home. I remember my father, bending to pick up fallen leaves, his strong hands, which I had kissed many times before. As we rounded a curve, we came upon a crumbling shanty, its plastered walls rotting and its floor barely above the ground, resembling the hovels of the poor everywhere. It seemed abandoned by those once ashamed to live there. A barking dog greeted us, and a fat blonde woman, Ruth, stood at the door with her little boy, Roger, who watched me intently. Ruth, wearing a clean apron, shook my hand with delight, though I couldn't help but notice her rough, labor-worn hands. Inside, the room was bare except for old furniture and the familiar scent of apples. Ruth busied herself preparing a meal, filling the table with fried chicken, rice, peas, and corn, while Roger ate politely.
Isn't he nice looking?
His father asked. You are a handsome boy, Roger, I said. The boy smiled at me.
You look like Daddy,
he said. Afterwards, I noticed an old picture leaning on the top of a dresser and stood to pick it up. It was yellow and soiled with many fingerings. The faded figure of a woman in Philippine dress could yet be distinguished, although the face had become a blur. I began.
I don't know who she is.
Fabia hastened to say.
I picked that picture many years ago in a room on LaSalle Street in Chicago. I have often wondered who she is.
The face wasn't a blur in the beginning.
Oh no, it was a young face and good.
Ruth came with a plate full of apples. Ah, I cried, picking out a ripe one. I've been thinking where all the scent of apples came from.
I'll show you,
said Fabia. He showed me a back room, not very big. It was half full of apples.
Every day,
he explained.
I take some of them to town to sell to the groceries. Prices have been low. I've been losing on the trips.
These apples will spoil, I said.
We'll feed them to the pigs.
At twilight, Fabia showed me the farm, with bare apple trees against the glowing sky. He recalled a winter before Roger was born, when he had appendicitis. Despite being pregnant and unwell, Ruth bundled him up, cleared the snow, and carried him to the road, waiting for help while snow fell and she struggled to keep him warm.
Go back to the house, Ruth.
Her husband cried.
You'll freeze to death.
But she clung to him wordlessly. Even as she massaged his arms and legs, her tears rolled down her cheeks.
I won't leave you,
she repeated. The U.S. mail car arrived, and the mailman, familiar with Fabia and Ruth, took them directly to the nearest hospital. Ruth stayed by Fabia's side, sleeping in the corridor and working hard to cover expenses by scrubbing floors and washing dishes. Fabia remarked that Ruth was a nice girl, like Filipino women. Before nightfall, he drove me back to the hotel. Ruth and Roger waved goodbye as we left, the light from their shanty flickering behind them. On the drive, Fabia was silent, and I had nothing to say either. When we arrived at the hotel, Fabia quietly extended his hand, and I shook it, realizing this might be the last time we'd meet. Tell Ruth and Roger, I said, I love them. He dropped my hand quickly.
Well, I guess I won't be seeing you again. They'll be waiting for me now,
he said. Look, I said, not knowing why I said it, one of these days, very soon, I hope, I'll be going home. I could go to your town.
No,
he said softly, sounding very much defeated but brave.
Thanks a lot. But you see, nobody would remember me now.
Then he started the car, and as it moved away, he waved his hand. Goodbye, I said, waving back into the darkness. And suddenly the night was cold like winter straying early in these northern woodlands. I hurried inside. There was a train the next morning that left for Muncie, Indiana, at 8:15.
Until the next time, feel free to like this video and subscribe if you're not yet subscribed. Goodbye!